southern Iceland, deep in January. Inside a longhouse, a fire runs the length of the floor with no chimney above it. Outside, a wind coming straight off the ice. In here, you would take your cloak off. That fire has burned since October, and it will still be burning in April. Now cross to England, the same winter. One room, a thin wall of mud and sticks, and a small fire that will be cold ash before dawn. Same century, same weather. One of those houses kept its family warm and dry for generations. The other quietly worked against the people sleeping in it, every cold season of their lives. Today, why the Viking Longhouse never froze, and what the medieval house was doing to the family inside it. And at the end, the real reason Europe never copied the answer. Nobody was hiding it. They simply were not allowed to build it. That English house has a name, Warham Percy, a Yorkshire hillside, the most studied abandoned village in the country, dug from 1950 to 1990. 40 years, 40 peasant plots, and those houses left so little behind that archaeologists still argue about how the walls were built. Step inside one in January while it still stood. You are in a single room. The floor under your boots is bare earth, with cut rushes thrown over it. The walls are woven sticks packed with mud about as thick as your hand is long. Above you, a straw roof that drinks every rain that falls on it. The fire in the middle of the floor is small because the wood feeding it is not yours to take freely. Before dawn, it will be cold ash, and everything you own will be an hour colder than it was at midnight. You will not be sleeping much, and neither will anyone else in that room. 800 miles north, a Viking family spends the same January inside walls of stacked turf 2 meters thick. Beside them, that fire that has not gone out since autumn. We know those walls in detail because in 1104, a volcano buried a whole valley of these farms in southern Iceland. Dig the ash off, and the turf is still standing, 1,000 years on. Here is what should bother you. The English peasant was not living in some alien design. Excavators at Warham found longhouses, long, narrow buildings, family at one end, animals at the other. The same floor plan the Norse used, so the gap was never the concept. Two peoples built the same house, and one version protected its family, while the other wore its family down. The difference sat in a handful of design decisions and in who was free to make them. Which raises the only question that matters. What did the Vikings do differently? The first decision sounds small and decided everything. The fire never went out. Every evening, a Viking household raked its embers together and buried them under ash. Starved of air, they smoldered until morning instead of dying. At first light, someone pulled the ash back, fed the coals, and the flame stood up again. No flint, no tinder, no hour of shivering while the room caught up. A slow engine, banked at night and opened by day, for months without a break. You can only run a fire like that if fuel is never a question, and for the Norse, it never was. In Iceland and along the Atlantic coasts, the answer lay under their feet. Peat, cut from their own ground in summer, dried in the wind, hauled in before the snow. It burns low and long, exactly what a banked hearth wants. A whole winter of heat out of a field they owned, with nobody's permission required. Now look at the walls, because this is where that fire gets spent twice. Turf blocks came off the same land, stacked until the base of the wall ran 2 meters thick. That is not a barrier. That is a battery. All day the hearth pushed heat into the earth behind it. Dense soil takes heat slowly, the way a stone floor holds sun long after the sun has gone. At night, with the fire banked to embers, the wall handed it back. The room never fell to the temperature outside because it was no longer warmed by the fire alone. It was warmed by everything that fire had put into the building since October. Slow is the whole point. Heat took hours to crawl through 2 meters of packed earth, and by then more had gone in behind it. Nothing was lost, only delayed. Have that wall, and the system stops working. Then they sealed it. Almost no windows, because a hole is a hole. Doors low and narrow, so every entry traded as little warm air as possible. Snow was left banked against the outside, and a buried wall is one the fire no longer has to fight. We covered the raw physics of turf in our video on Longhouse heating. What matters here is the arithmetic. One field gave them the fuel and the store to keep it in. Now cross to England, and the equation falls apart. Woodland belonged to the lord of the manor, and gathering fuel from it was a granted privilege, measured and limited. What you burned beyond it, you bought. And when heat carries a price, you ration it. Less fire, lit later, allowed to die sooner. By around 1300, firewood had grown scarce enough around London that the city was already burning coal shipped down the coast by boat. Filthy stuff, unpopular, cheaper than wood. A capital priced out of its own fuel, centuries before anyone called it an energy crisis. This is where people split, so let me say where I stand. Plenty of writers explain the whole thing away in one line. The Norse built like this because they had no wood, no forests, no choice. So the Longhouse was not clever. It was just what was left. I think that is lazy. Other cultures ran out of timber and went on being cold anyway. Almost none worked out that a wall can hold heat, or that keeping a fire alive costs less than lighting a new one each morning. Shortage gives you limits. It does not hand you a system. Tell me if you think I am giving them too much credit. That is decision 1, and it kept them warm. The next one is the one that kept them alive. Ask what made a medieval house dangerous, and everyone answers the cold. The record points somewhere else. The killer was damp. A dry house at freezing temperature is survivable. People sleep through it wrapped in wool and wake up stiff and fine. A wet house is a different machine. Damp air strips heat from a body far faster than dry air, and wet walls never stop pulling warmth from a room. A family breathing cold, wet air for 5 months hands its lungs to every infection the winter carries. The old burial records tell the story. The deadly months were not the depths of December. They came at the end of winter, when bodies worn down by months of damp cold finally gave out. So, the real engineering question was never how to make heat. It was how to stay dry. And this is where the two houses split. That Viking fire that never went out was not just a heater. It was a dryer. A low, constant flame pulled moisture out of the air, the bedding, the walls, and the roof timbers, every day, all winter. The building was not warmed. It was cured, the way a hull stays sound because someone keeps tarring it, and turf sheds water down its grassy face instead of drinking it. The medieval cottage ran the opposite cycle. The straw roof soaked up rain and let it creep down into the walls, the mud-packed walls, wicked groundwater upward, and the fire died every night, so the drying stopped every night. Every morning, that house started colder and wetter than the one before. Anyone who has fought damp in an old house knows this enemy personally. The patch that keeps coming back, the smell behind the cupboard, the window that cries every cold morning. You paint over it, and it waits. You know exactly how that fight ends if the heating ever stops. Now imagine the heating stopping every night of your life. I want to hear those stories because half of owning an old house is this exact war. What was the worst damp problem you ever chased, and what finally beat it? Put it below. None of this was the whole system, by the way. The building was half of it. The other half was worn and slept in, and that half got its own video. So why did the smoke-filled Viking house stay healthy while the medieval one bred sickness? Careful. That question assumes the Viking house cost nothing. It did not, and the price they paid is where this story stops being simple. Time to be honest about the Longhouse, because the Vikings paid for that warmth, and they paid in smoke. A central fire with no chimney kept a permanent haze under the roof. Eyes stung and soot settled on everything, and the bones remember it. Skeletal studies of people who lived their lives over open hearths show chronic sinus disease at rates that would empty a modern town. But look at what the Norse built to manage it, because nobody mentions this part. The haze was not left to drift. The pitch of the roof held that layer high, above head height. The dirtiest air in the building hung where nobody lived, and they gave it a valve. Adjustable vents in the ridge, worked by hand from the floor. Open them wide and the air cleared, but the heat went with it. Close them down, and the house held its warmth, and you lived in the haze. Somebody made that call every day for 3 centuries, reading the wind, the fuel, and the cold. That is the whole Viking method in one object, not a solution, a dial. Now watch what happens when nobody gets to choose. The chimney reached ordinary English houses in the 1500s, and on paper it was a straight win. Smoke went up the flue instead of into your lungs. That part was real. But a chimney does 2 other things nobody reckoned on. It takes the fire off the middle of the floor and puts it against a wall. Most of the heat now goes up the shaft rather than into the people, and to draw, it needs air, so it pulls cold outdoor air through every gap in the house all night. Colder rooms, permanent drafts, a building that never dries. The people living through the change said so themselves. A churchman named William Harrison listened to the old men of his village in 1577. In their young days, they told him, the whole town had 2 or 3 chimneys, and the smoke found its own way out. Now, chimneys stood everywhere, and they did not call it an improvement. The smoke, they insisted, had toughened the house timbers and worked as a kind of medicine. And back in their day, nobody's head ever ached, whereas the soft young generation, and Harrison's word for them was tenderlings, did nothing but sniffle and complain of colds. Old men announcing that the youth have gone soft in 1577. Some traditions never freeze either. Now that is a grumble, not a medical study, and smoke was never good for anyone. But strip it away, and a real machine sits underneath. The Longhouse traded air for heat and left the dial in the household's hands. The chimney made the same trade in reverse, welded shut. 2 houses, 2 opposite trades, and we still have not touched the fastest way a medieval home could kill you. It is the reason one word in your language means what it means. If this channel teaches you things your history classes skipped, the like button is the one bit of feedback the algorithm actually listens to. There is a single object that explains the last great difference between these houses: a bell. In English towns, it rang each evening, and every household covered its fire for the night. The order came from the Old French for cover the fire, and worn down by centuries of English mouths, That phrase became the word curfew. The first curfews were never about keeping people indoors. They were about fear of what the roofs were made of, because the medieval house was built out of things that burn. Bare clay floors under dry rushes, and a roof of straw and reed above them, a sparks flight from the neighbor's chimney. After a devastating fire in 1212, London banned new thatch outright. Its aldermen had to keep long iron hooks on hand for tearing burning thatch off houses. A city keeping demolition tools ready for its own rooftops tells you how it slept. So, the medieval house was trapped. Its roof was too flammable to let the fire live, and its walls too wet to survive it dying. Now, take that test to a longhouse and watch how many decisions have to line up for nothing to happen. Hold a flame to a turf wall, and you lose the argument. Wet earth bound with living grass roots will not take a spark, and the roof is the same material over birch bark. The one genuinely flammable part is the timber frame, and that stood under a century of hearth soot. Soot-blacked wood is stubborn stuff to light, so the smoke they lived with all winter was quietly fireproofing the skeleton of the building. Then look at the fire itself, not piled against a wall, but sunk into a trench of laid stone cut into the floor, so the flame sits below everything around it. Banked under ash at night, it barely showed a flame at all. So a Norse fire could burn unattended all night, with nobody lying awake over it, which is exactly why it did. And there is the loop this entire video runs on. A roof that will not burn lets the fire live. A living fire keeps the walls charged and the building dry. A dry building keeps the family well. Norse farms also stood apart, so no neighbor's ember was ever coming for anyone's roof. How seriously does England still take this? When Shakespeare's Globe was rebuilt in the 1990s, its thatched roof was the first permitted in London since the Great Fire of 1666. Permission came with conditions. A reconstruction of a 16th century playhouse carries fire retardant in its reeds and sprinklers in its ridge. 3.5 centuries on, London still does not trust that roof. 1,000 years of building, and the score is this. The House of Earth outlived the civilization that built it. The House of Straw is still on probation. Which leaves the question this video promised at the start. If the turf system worked this well, why did Europe never copy it? Not ignorance, permission. Everything the system ran on, the wall material, the fuel, the freedom to cut both, came off land the household controlled. Medieval Europe locked that door. In England, the right to cut peat from common land was a legal privilege with its own name. The right of turberry. It came only as a grant tied to your holding, and the Lord's Court decided who cut and how much. A peasant could understand the turf house perfectly and still be unable to build one. The knowledge was free, the ground was not. And where the ground stayed free, the answer refused to die. Not by centuries, by living memory. In 1910, half the housing stock of Iceland was still turf, and the last families left those farmhouses around 1966. On the Isle of Lewis, a house stood occupied into the mid-1960s. Peat fire on an open central hearth, no chimney, animals under the same roof. A Viking floor plan lived in the same decade England won the World Cup. Some of you were alive while that fire burned, and one detail from that house has stayed with me. Its last resident was moved out into a comfortable modern place across the road. Before long, she moved back, and her reason is on the record. The new house was too damp. Handed a straight choice between the 20th century and the Viking system, she tested both and went back to the older one. And before we file damp away as solved, Britain still publishes an excess winter death count. In a bad winter, it has run past 60,000. Around a third are respiratory, with cold and damp housing among the recurring risk factors. We have central heating now. We are still losing that argument. Strip it back, and the Viking house is one machine with 4 moving parts, each holding up the next. Fuel out of ground nobody had to ask about, so the fire never has to go out. A wall thick enough to take that heat in all day and hand it back all night, so the fire never has to be big. A fire running around the clock, drying the building while it warms it. And a roof of the one material that will not catch, the only reason anyone dares leave a fire burning unattended. Pull out any one, and the other 3 fall over. That is not a pile of good ideas. That is a system. The people of Warham Percy were not fools. They built the same Longhouse, family at one end and animals at the other, through the same winters. What they could not do was assemble that chain. Their fuel was rationed by a court, so the fire died at night. Mud and sticks store nothing, so nothing carried the house to morning. And a straw roof meant the law itself demanded the fire be put out. Every link broken, each break breaking the next. So the honest answer is not that one people were clever and the other were not. Both understood the winter. Only one owned every piece of the machine that beat it. If you want more history told at this depth, subscribing is how you keep it coming. 1,000 years on, the archaeology gives its verdict quietly. The rented house vanished. The owned one is still standing.